Greetings. I'm Don Moss with Saybrook University in Pasadena, California. I'm going to be speaking to you about nature contact and its effects on stress, resilience, and health. I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. All images in the presentation are utilized with license or permission. My email is on the screen now in case you have questions later. My topics will include what have poets and philosophers to say about nature, then talking about Shinrin yoku or forest bathing, horticultural therapy, some of the physiological effects that are demonstrated for nature exposure, what are some of the conceptual models attempting to explain the effects of nature, and also information on direct biochemical effects of being in nature. Then I will take a look at the dose, the duration, and the schedule of nature contact if you wish to receive benefit. I will briefly talk about the experiential or spiritual effects of nature contact, then examine nature immersion and lifestyle, and finally look at barriers to nature access. Beginning with the poets and the philosophers, Hippocrates, the ancient Greek physician, said, "Nature itself is the best physician." The Buddha is supposed to have said, "If you wish to know the divine, feel the wind on your face and the warm sun on your hand." Henry David Thoreau, the American essayist, wrote that in the woods we return to reason and faith. There I feel nothing can befall me in life, no disgrace, no calamity. An American naturalist wrote, "I go to nature to be soothed and healed and to have my senses put in order." And finally, John Muir, an American naturalist, a real pioneer in emphases on preserving nature, wrote that, "Allow nature's peace to flow into you as sunshine flows into trees." And now the movement of Shinrin yoku, forest bathing, which began in Japan. In the 1980s, this movement promoted the health benefits of nature exposure. The term Shinrin yoku was introduced by the Japan Forestry Agency in 1982. Shinrin yoku often includes a walk in the forest, yoga, meditation, paced breathing, and other activities in natural settings to induce relaxation. The movement of Shinrin yoku inspired hundreds of research studies claiming dramatic physiological, emotional, and mental benefits of nature exposure. Initially, many of the studies were inconsistent and flawed, lacking rigorous research design. Over time, the research has become much more rigorous and convincing, as shown in a systematic review by Kotera et al. In 2020. Nature exposure can include many things: short walks in natural areas, extended wilderness stays, listening to nature sounds, time spent in one's own garden, virtual reality exposure to nature, paintings of natural landscapes, and even contact with houseplants. These photos actually are taken in my own garden and also in nearby natural areas. In a recent review, Kirsten Ware reported the following benefits of nature contact: improved attention, lower stress, better mood, increases in happiness, reduced risk of psychiatric disorders, and increases in empathy and cooperation. There is an overlapping development, the movement of horticultural therapy, which primarily applies nature exposure to patients in healthcare settings. Horticultural therapy engages patients directly in gardening activities. Horticultural therapy uses contact with plants and the soil, gardening activities, and exposure to nature for therapeutic benefit. Hospital gardens, garden carts at the bedside, and home gardens are all utilized as part of horticultural therapy during hospital stays, clinic stays, and also in discharge planning. Solid research has documented the benefits in applying horticultural therapy for cardiovascular rehabilitation, physical rehabilitation, persons with disabilities, memory care, and many other areas. This is a photo shared by Dr. Tamami Shirai of a green hospital in Singapore, which has taken the concept of greening up the hospital setting to an extreme, a beautiful setting. So, what do we know from research about the physiological effects of exposure to nature? These are some of the measured physiological effects during and after nature exposure. We see an increase in vagal nerve activity, and the vagal nerve is the carrier for parasympathetic nervous system activity, which is also increased by nature exposure. Corollary to increased vagal activity, we see a reduction in heart rate, an increase in the variability of heart rate, which is associated with good health and resilience, and a reduction in blood pressure. We also see enhanced immune function, reductions in the human stress response, and as part of that, we see a reduction in salivary cortisol. Now, there are several models which have been developed to explain the beneficial effects of nature exposure. The psychologist Erich Fromm coined the term biophilia to refer to the passionate love of life and the love for all that is alive. In 1984, Edward Wilson took this word biophilia and developed the biophilia hypothesis. Humans have a genetically based evolutionary tendency, an adaptive tendency to focus on life and lifelike processes. According to the biophilia hypothesis, the human species evolved over millennia in adaptation to the natural world. As the urban and industrial environment evolved, natural elements were replaced by concrete, brick, and asphalt. Too radical a separation from nature produces adverse effects, including a chronic state of stress. The biophilia hypothesis triggered a critique of the typical human-built, usually urban environment. One result is the movement to create more green spaces in urban areas and green elements in buildings. And this movement, fortunately, is global. This is just a small example in Chicago, Illinois, a city near me. Chicago had many derelict vacant lots where homes had been torn down, homes no longer in use. And the project called New Potential for Vacant Lots began planting gardens, enlisting local residents to participate in the planting of the gardens to create small green spaces in neighborhoods throughout the city. A second theory evolved to explain the positive benefits of nature exposure. This is called attention restoration theory. Over half of the global population now lives in urban areas with reduced contact with nature. Globally, we see people moving off the farms, away from villages, into urban areas for income, for jobs. And that move to urban areas is accompanied by a loss of contact, a loss of daily contact with nature. Kaplan and others have observed that the human-built environment is intentionally dense, with stimuli competing for human attention. If you live in a city, sirens may be constant. Phones and devices message us incessantly. Media is dense with visual and auditory stimuli demanding attention, rapid fire messaging on television, on iPads, iPhones, smartphones everywhere. A key element in cognitive mental well-being is the ability to focus voluntarily on a task or stimulus. When we have the human-built urban environment, we're surrounded with signal overload. This signal overload produces attention fatigue. Sustaining directed attentional focus when there are so many competing demands, distractions, things that call our attention, creates chronic stress. In contrast, natural environments present fewer intentional demands and serve to restore attentional resources. In a systematic review, Stevenson et al. Compared responses to an urban environment to responses to natural environments. They found that the persisting effort to direct and focus attention to a stimulus or task requires cognitive effort, especially in a stimulus-dense environment. Suppressing strong distractions in order to maintain attention depletes our cognitive resources and undermines health and well-being. Exposure to nature, on the other hand, produces improvements that can be measured in working memory, cognitive control, and attentional control. Both real and virtual nature exposure moderate this stress, but real natural environments produce greater restoration. Longer exposure to nature appears to produce greater cognitive restoration, and I will return to this question later. How much exposure do we need to nature in order to get some benefit? A third theory evolved to explain the negative effects of the human-built urban environment and the positive effects of nature. This third theory is called stress recovery theory. This is an extension of traditional stress theory. Walter Cannon published a book called The Wisdom of the Body in 1932. He identified the human stress response as a biological cross-species fight or flight response, a response to threat. In 1956, Hans Selye took stress theory further, identified the general adaptation syndrome as a three-phased response to threat. When some kind of stress impacts us, we go initially into an alarm phase in which our body mobilizes a response to the threat. Then if the stress or threat is prolonged, our body goes into a resistance stage, attempting to sustain itself in the face of stress. Finally, we enter an exhaustion and depletion phase, and this phase often is accompanied by illness, anxiety, mental dysregulation, depletion of organismic resources, and even death. Later, Bruce McEwen took stress theory further, emphasizing that human beings need some stress and challenge to retain our vitality. Bruce McEwen labeled this good stress as eustress, keeping me fit, keeping me sharp. But when threats are toxic or when they're persistent, overwhelming our ability to adapt, then distress results. McEwen coined the term allostasis for the organism's effort to maintain equilibrium in the face of stress. So when we live with ongoing stress, our bodies attempt to adapt and to maintain an equilibrium. Allostatic load is the cumulative wear and tear on the organism from excessive and prolonged stress. The human stress response is a psychophysiological response to threat that mobilizes the organism's resources to combat threat. And the urban, human-built environment triggers this stress response. This response is marked by elevated muscle tension, increased heart rate, increased respiration rate, activation of the sympathetic nervous system, dilation of the pupils, redirection of blood flow to vital organ functions, and an increased circulation of norepinephrine, adrenaline, and cortisol. Now, initially, the stress response is an attempt to adapt to a stressful situation. So each of these factors, from elevated muscle tension to a redirection of blood flow, assists the body to respond, to mobilize its response to threat. When prolonged, however, this stress response produces harm. Benson, back in 1974, identified the relaxation response. This is the very opposite of the human stress response. The human relaxation response reverses the many effects of stress. Instead of tensing, our muscles relax. We reduce our breathing rate. We reduce our heart rate and our blood pressure. We reduce the circulation of stress hormones, and we activate the parasympathetic nervous system instead of the sympathetic nervous system. So when we engage, for example, in meditation or relaxation exercises, slow breathing, for example, we're evoking the relaxation response and producing this beneficial physiological and emotional state. According to the stress recovery theory, the human-built environment in which increasing portions of the world population lives creates a form of environmental stress. Ulrich and his colleagues in several publications emphasized crowding, community noise, traffic, heat stress, and pollution as distinctive common forms of stress. Anderson added another term, technostress, to describe the effects of the technological communications environment. Modern persons are continually connected. We're on call. We're on demand. We're repeatedly checking and responding to texts, emails, notifications, and updates. According to stress recovery theory, exposure to nature gives us a pathway to recovery from chronic stress. Psychological restoration through nature includes emotional recovery, cognitive restoration, a return to physiological regulation, and behavioral recovery. Forest bathing or immersion in nature also has a direct biochemical effect on the human organism. Trees and plants emit volatile phytoncides, organic compounds that are believed to stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system, boost immune function, lower physiological stress levels, enhance well-being, and improve sleep. Now, there are a number of studies, and I cite here Luann Fortune from 2024 and Lee from 2022. Along with the slides from this presentation, I'm providing the Japanese Society of Lifestyle Medicine with my reference list, which includes all of the references cited in this PowerPoint. Again, direct biochemical effects. To assess the direct biochemical effects of phytoncides, apart from any soothing aesthetic effects of nature, Lee and colleagues designed the following study. They recruited 12 healthy subjects to stay in an urban hotel, and they piped phytoncides into the room so they would be breathing phytoncides. The subjects showed increased natural killer cell activity, lower levels of T cells, lower adrenaline, and lower noradrenaline in their urine. So we had a boost in the immune system and a reduction in the stress response when the 12 subjects were breathing the phytoncides. The authors concluded that phytoncides are a significant mechanism by which nature exposure enhances immune activity and produces physiological relaxation. Now, this is interesting because there is a great deal of research showing that paintings of natural landscapes, virtual reality presentations of nature can produce some of the effects of forest bathing, soothing the person, reducing the stress level, inducing some relaxation. And yet, virtual exposure does not have these phytoncides. So that may be the reason that usually direct access to nature and contact with nature has a more extensive and pervasive effect than the virtual exposure, which only gives us the aesthetics of nature. Phytoncides in the immune system. Luann Fortune did a very nice systematic review of over 1,300 studies on phytoncides and their impact on the immune system. They were quite rigorous in examining which of these studies were well designed and should be included in their analysis. They actually included only 8 of the best constructed studies in their meta-analysis. They documented significant immunological outcomes of exposure to phytoncides, including increases in NK natural killer cells, T cells, and cytotoxic effector molecules. So again, we're getting examples which show us a boost in the immune system from exposure to phytoncides. So that's the direct biochemical effect of the compounds that are emitted by plants and trees in a natural setting. So how much do we need? How much nature contact can actually produce a benefit? Um, how often do we need to be in nature? What kind of a schedule and so on? There's a lot of different relevant research. Um, ask ourselves, how long an exposure is needed for an effect? How long does the benefit last? What should happen during the nature contact? Wouldn't a walk in the city have the same effect as a walk in the forest? Or would a VR, virtual reality forest visit have the same effect? So an early review by Barton and Pretty found that large benefits from short engagements in exercise in green landscapes and diminishing but still positive returns from longer periods. Bettman et al. More recently reviewed 78 studies of nature exposure, specifically for people with mental illness. Those subjects who had at least 10 minutes of nature exposure showed reductions in salivary cortisol and salivary amylase. These are 2 markers for stress. So their stress response was reduced by even 10 minutes of nature exposure. Those research participants with 20 to 30 minutes showed larger decreases in salivary cortisol and salivary amylase. So more is better, but even 10 minutes produced some benefit. White et al. Did a study found that persons with multiple nature exposures in a week, adding up to 120 minutes or more, showed greater health benefits than those with less. Bettman looked at discernible lasting health benefit and found very little discernible lasting benefit from a single time nature exposure. So just going to the park once and having no follow-up is not likely to produce a great deal of benefit. The Bettman study also concluded that more is better. Total exposure time correlated with increasing benefit up to about 600 minutes in a week. Beyond that, didn't seem to have much additional effect, but up until 600 minutes, the more time we have in nature, the better. In spite of inconsistent study results, we can conclude that more and longer nature exposure, including activities in nature, produces greater benefit. Multiple intervals of nature exposure totaling 120 minutes a week or more are optimal, and multiple exposures over time appear advantageous over a single exposure. But again, we know that exercise benefits our well-being, and we know that many forms of nature contact include exercise. So we can ask, nature contact often takes the form in the walk of a walk in the forest, meditating in the forest, or doing yoga in the forest. Could one get the same benefit taking a walk or doing yoga in the city? Well, Vogt did a study comparing the effects of doing similar exercise in a green space to doing it in an urban setting. As expected, both were beneficial. Exercise, wherever we do it, produces beneficial effects. However, participants reported significantly more enjoyment after exercising in nature. Exercises in a natural environment also produced greater revitalization, positive engagement, tranquility, positive emotion, and less exhaustion. So, when possible, it's better to take our walk or do our yoga in a green space. What about virtual, visual, and auditory exposure to nature? People have done a lot of really rich, innovative studies trying to look at these benefits. For example, if we have somebody in a hospital bed, it's hard to actually take them into a green space. In addition, transporting individuals for nature presents cost barriers. So researchers have used a variety of strategies to present patients with nature in the hospital or in a clinic. One early study by Ulrich showed that patients with a window view of trees recovered more quickly and used less pain medicine than those with a view of a brick wall. So when possible, plant a garden or otherwise create green space outside the hospital window. Marcus concluded that hospital gardens have come of age. Hospital gardens, green spaces on the hospital grounds or in a courtyard within the hospital, can improve well-being with emotional, mental, and physical health benefits for patients, their families, and staff. But she also cautioned about optimal design for health benefits, and there is an evolving body of research on how best to lay out a hospital garden. Based on a review of 28 research reports, another research team, Nieberlell, Walker, and others, concluded that on-site hospital gardens can produce measurable health effects, including reductions in stress and anxiety. Giedelin et al. Conducted an exhaustive review of research on nature contact in hospitals, including natural light, window views, potted plants, nature paintings, and nature soundscapes. They reported small but significant health effects of nature contact of various kinds. Primarily, they found reduced anxiety, reduced depression, reduced pain, and for the hospital's benefit, increased patient satisfaction. One study explored efforts to create more natural greening elements in public areas of the ward. Patients on greened wards had more normal vital signs, less pain, they used fewer pain medicines, and they had reduced lengths of stay, so we're affecting the cost of the hospital stay by creating green spaces with plants, living things in the hospital setting. Several studies examined the health effects of introducing nature sounds into the hospital environment or playing nature sounds by headphone for patients. They found improvements in sleep, reduced pain, and increased relaxation. Now, obviously, the auditory exposure to nature sounds, will not include those natural compounds, the phytoncides, but apparently even the sounds of nature engage us enough with nature to reduce the stress. A systematic review concluded that realistic nature paintings on hospital walls increase patient satisfaction and reduce reports of stress, anxiety, and pain. According to this study by Cardio and Chatterjee, the effects of realistic nature paintings was greater and more consistent than the effects of abstract or non-representational art. So having a natural landscape actually produces greater benefit. There are additional studies on visual exposure. Ulrich in another study presented 50 nature scenes or 50 urban scenes to match groups of mildly stressed university students. Viewing the nature scenes produced significantly more positive result, with higher levels of positive affect, lower levels of fearfulness, and lower levels of emotional arousal. Viewing the urban scenes produced increased feelings of sadness and mildly increased anger or aggression. So again, positive effects from the nature scenes. Little Scare et al. Attempted virtual reality exposure, and they tried a couple of different forms. They used a treadmill exercise either with 360-degree visual presentation of nature or a 3D virtual reality nature scene while on the treadmill. Both kinds of nature scenes enhance the enjoyment of participants. Interestingly, with a 360-degree scene, the participants walked more slowly, getting less aerobic benefit. There was no significant difference between virtual nature and blank wall subjects in their physiological recovery from the treadmill exercise. So the virtual nature did not help people's heart rate return to normal, for example. The authors also acknowledged that their virtual presentation of nature did not produce the many reported benefits of exercising in an actual green space. Frost used a systematic review to assess benefits of exposure to virtual nature. Lots of inconsistencies so far in reports on virtual nature exposure. Most studies found some positive effect for overall psychological well-being. Many studies showed a reduction in negative affect, negative emotion, with less evidence for increases in positive affect. So we may be able to reduce the stress response, but we're not going to produce as much positive emotion. The type of nature scene presented made a difference. Natural scenes which were rich in biodiversity seemed to produce better effects. A variety of plants, a variety of trees, perhaps animals. Cyber sickness, anxiety with the virtual reality, and balance issues outweighed the benefits with some VR systems. And cyber sickness has been a side effect, an adverse effect in a number of virtual reality studies. So we have to keep track of this and take it into account. Underwater virtual reality scenes for most people produced fear and a sense of threat. So they did not seem to produce the same benefit of for example, a forest scene. Well, people have been going to nature for their soul for millennia, whether we look at Eastern or Western spirituality. So we should take into account Eastern spiritual perspectives. Buddhism includes an emphasis on the wilderness and on woodlands. The Buddha, when he achieved his enlightenment, is reported to have been in a forest grove meditating on the Bodhi tree. Forest monasteries have provided a place for contemplation away from urban life throughout Asia. Taoism relies extensively on nature images to describe the Tao, the way of life. So we find elements of nature in Eastern spirituality. The same is true in Western spirituality. Beginning in the 3rd century, what are called the Desert Fathers and Desert Mothers, monks and nuns who withdrew from cities, sought spiritual awakening in the wilderness, and we have an abundance of books and research articles reporting on their experience of nature. Later in the medieval period, many monasteries and convents were built in remote natural areas, and nature served as a focus for meditation. Nature has served as a liminal space, a space of temptation, personal testing, and transformation. If we look at Christian scriptures, Jesus sought out the wilderness of Judea for 40 days and underwent dramatic temptations. Or to look at Native Americans, Native American youth were initiated into their adult identities with vision quests, typically in desert or wilderness settings. Of course, these varied from one tribe to another, but it is very common to send adolescents out into nature to find their adult identity and their direction for life. Well, I'm speaking to a Society for Lifestyle Medicine, so I think it is important to talk about lifestyle. The research evidence supports greater benefit for multiple exposures with nature over time. There are programs that provide beautiful nature exposure while in hospital or in a spa resort setting based on brief exposures to nature with no follow-up. If there is no follow-up, they will have less benefit. Sustained coaching interventions seem to be appropriate to build nature exposure into lifestyle. This seems to be optimal. I would love to go to, in fact, I have gone to a nature spa out in Arizona, a place called Marival, which was very restorative for me. Now, for me, the follow-up is that I live in a natural area. I can wander in my own garden. I can wander the Lake Michigan beach across the street from my home. But if someone lives in an urban setting, sending them once to a nature spa is not enough. How can we encourage ongoing integration of nature exposure into their lifestyle long term? Kotera and Lee, in different systematic reviews, have documented the mental health benefits of nature immersion. Individuals with depression, anxiety, stress, and anger all show emotional improvements even with brief exposure to nature. So again, how can we intervene to encourage green time as a more widespread part of community lifestyle to address community mental health? Much attention has been given to food deserts, urban areas with little availability of healthy nutrition. There are also many urban areas devoid of green space. This is a challenge. Frequent transportation to natural settings at great distance from home are primarily available for the affluent. Now, many cities are working on increasing the presence of parks and urban green spaces. The global movement for innovative green spaces is spreading. Near my home, there's a hospital system, Trinity Health in Muskegon, Michigan, which has developed a community garden providing healthy food in low-income areas. I've worked in that garden, weeded in that garden. Children are brought in from their schools to participate in activities interacting with the green space. The physicians in the nearby hospital and outpatient clinics are experimenting with writing a prescription to obtain bags of food from this community garden. Now, this community garden is in a neighborhood, a low-income neighborhood with very little green space. So things like this can make a big difference. For families struggling for daily survival, however, using the green space is often not a priority. Even public transport costs can be a barrier. Cultural disinclinations to outdoor activity is a problem. For young people, addiction to screen time is a problem. I live across the street from a park on a natural lakeshore, and it's not unusual for me to see an adolescent on the beach, but not making eye contact or any visible contact with nature. Rather, they're absorbed with their smartphone or their tablet. The effects of depression are a barrier as well. The effects of depression can hinder going outside, having any engagement with nature. All of these things are barriers. From a resilience perspective, nature is a low-cost enhancer of adaptive capacity. We have to frame nature contact as a public health goal, as an ecosystem service, inviting broader policy integration, especially in urban planning. Programs such as physicians writing a prescription for a walk or for green space time show clinical promise. There is a British program called The Dose of Nature. This program accepts physician referrals and provides an eight-week program orienting patients to the mental health benefit of nature contact. So we need programs like this to increase disadvantaged populations engaging with nature. Innovative therapeutic and coaching interventions also increase nature engagements. In my own clinical practice in the past, I've offered discounts for therapy hours in exchange for time-stamped photographs of the patient at a beach or nature park. Early in my practice, I was surprised to learn that even though I live in an area surrounded by natural beauty, the Lake Michigan shore, sand dunes, forested parks, several rivers and lakes, it was not unusual for me to see a depressed patient who had not seen Lake Michigan for 10 years. Um, they would often say something like, "Oh, I've thought about it. I think I should get to the lake sometime." And yet, in their daily life, they were not getting into any engagement with nature. And I saw this as part of contributing to their depression. So again, we have to integrate coaching and encouragement of nature engagement in many forms into whatever type of professional service we provide. I want to thank you for your attention today. This is my email for any follow-up questions, dmoss@saybrook.edu. It has been my pleasure to address the Japanese Society of Lifestyle Medicine.